Setting B for Baker. Stand by. Baker set.
Instantaneous echo, sir.
Forward.
Hi, and welcome to Walt's Flicks Picks. This is a North American's view on great, mainly British, classic movies. And with that being said, today I'm going to start with a film that was a very easy choice for me. I've seen it numerous times, and I've even read the book that it's based on twice because I think it's that good. And that is 1953's The Cruel Sea, based on a novel by Nicholas Montserrat. Montserrat was a serving naval officer in World War II who fought in the Battle of the Atlantic. Somehow, while he was dodging U-boats and fighting his way through storms, he found time to keep notes. Did some writing during the war, and afterwards, in 1951, he published his masterpiece, which was The Cruel Sea. It immediately became a big success. It was a bestseller. The critics loved it, and the public liked it too because it was so honest and true to their experiences in the war. And of course, that's what translates and makes it such a wonderful film. Montserrat's also very good writing about characters. It's not just about action. In a way, he reminds me of C.S. Forester, the naval writer who wrote about Hornblower. There's a lot of psychology and interesting characters in those books. Of course, the real difference is Hornblower is all about rousing adventure, and The Cruel Sea is all about the grim realities of fighting U-boats in 39-45. So what's the film about? The story follows the crew of a corvette, the Compass Rose, through the entire course of the war, from 1939 to 1945, although some things happen that I don't want to spoil. And in that way, it's a bit like the better-known and somewhat more recent movie Das Boot, which looks at a U-boat crew for a long stretch of the war. And of course, this shows the flip side of that conflict, focusing on Brits in the Royal Navy and what they had to go through. And the major focus of the story is on the two leading commanders. That's Captain George Erickson, who is probably based a bit on Montserrat, and his first officer, Lieutenant Lockhart. Erickson was played by Jack Hawkins, and he basically carries the entire film. And it shows him from the start taking a new crew and molding it into shape, taking officers who are very inexperienced. For example, Lockhart's just basically a weekend sailor and a journalist before the war, and he has to turn these guys into toughened sea veterans to face the threat of the U-boats and the attacks on the convoys. So the character of Erickson is generally a likable man, but he's got a tough job to do. It looks at the loneliness of command. It looks at some of the hard decisions he's got to make. He's not perfect. There are some things that are going on in the wardroom that he should be paying attention to, but he misses, so there are conflicts with the officers that are serving under him. The film also does look at the experiences of the common seamen, and you've got chapters where people go on leave and you learn about their personal lives. And I think I have to stress that it's the personal stories, the believability. These are real men, basically most of them civilians who are now drawn into warfare and are having to cope with this. And the film does a tremendous job of depicting that. And of course, ultimately, they have to face the trials of combat. And the film goes from the tedium that they face, which is quite a bit like in Das Boot, some lengthy storms and all the horrors and the cold and the very harsh conditions of the North Atlantic, and then plunges them into the terror and exhilaration of combat and the difficulties that can cause. So what about the director? In this case, Charles Friend, who clearly was a great choice because this movie wound up being a big hit and was very well made, very true to the book. But why was that? Well, part of it was his experience. He'd started off as a film editor, of course, many future directors are, and worked on some very important British films. In 1939, he edited Goodbye, Mr. Chips, which was a big hit. I believe had some Oscar nominations. Later, he edited another important film, Major Barbara, which was based on a play by George Bernard Shaw. And both these films really delved into human relationships. They weren't adventure or action stories. They were about people relating to each other. And that's clearly one of the strengths that he brings to The Cruel Sea. Now, probably even more importantly, in 1948, when he stepped up to being a director, he makes one of the big hits of English movies in the 1940s. And that's 1948's Scott of the Antarctic, starring John Mills. And I remember they used to show this movie quite a bit on television here. And it was very well made, very gloomy, of course, because the story winds up with Scott's mission failing and basically his entire crew being wiped out. So it was a movie about men in harsh conditions, which was again very good training for him making The Cruel Sea. I think one of the reasons they don't show it as often right now is because a lot of the history of Scott has now been sort of overturned, and they look at all the mistakes he made. Now, Friend would go on after The Cruel Sea. He directed 1963's Torpedo Bay with James Mason, and interestingly, he directed about 9 episodes of the Danger Man TV series with Patrick McGoohan. His last film, that is Friend's last film, was as the second unit director on David Lean's Ryan's Daughter. Well, now I'd like to talk a bit about the performances. It's an ensemble cast and there's quite a bit to cover, but one of the fun things about The Cruel Sea is it's the chance to see many actors and actresses who were basically starting out, and they'd go on to noted careers internationally. Starting with Jack Hawkins, who of course is the star and, as I've mentioned, became a breakout international movie star as a result of the success of The Cruel Sea. A few years later he was in Bridge on the River Kwai, Ben-Hur, Zulu with his co-star from this film, Stanley Baker, Lawrence of Arabia, and he had a great career through the 60s. Then we have Denholm Elliott playing an officer named Morrell. Now he's a capable enough officer, and he's likable, but he has some trouble on the home front with a glamorous actress wife. Now Elliott would go on to have a fabulous career, mainly in character parts, and you'd see him in films as diverse as the comedy Trading Places with Dan Aykroyd and Eddie Murphy, to playing Marcus Brody in the Indiana Jones franchise. The Cruel Sea was also a big opportunity for Stanley Baker, who plays Bennett, basically the heel of the crew and of the wardroom. It's interesting that in the book, Bennett's character is an Australian, and he's not English as depicted in the film. I'm sure the filmmakers made a very canny decision there, not wanting to offend the Australian audience and also their contribution to the war effort. Montserrat balanced this out in the book by later having an Australian officer who was very solid and a good member of the crew. Now, Stanley Baker, just a year later, he played the heroic Richmond in Laurence Olivier's Richard III. Then in the 60s, he starred in epics such as Zulu, again with Jack Hawkins, and The Guns of Navarone. Getting out of the wardroom and looking at the regular crew, let's have a look at Irish character actor Liam Redmond, who plays the ship's chief engineer. Now, just as in Dust Boots, Star Trek, or Sand Pebbles, you always need that tense scene in the engine room where things have to get fixed. And Redmond is very stalwart in that scene, which is quite tense and one of the center parts of the film. Redmond also went on to have a long career in character parts, including playing Ryan O'Neill's guardian in Barry Lyndon. Donald Sinden gets second billing in this film, and he plays Lockhart, who becomes the first officer of the Compass Rose. Sinden, as an actor, continued to play establishment and government types in later years, most notably in the original version of Day of the Jackal, a movie that I hope to do later in this series. Finally, we have Virginia McKenna, who just shines as the Wren officer who falls in love with Lockhart. And there are two things I want to talk about in terms of this relationship. First of all, the wartime romance offers a nice and short break from all the grim and hard duties that the men are going through during the campaign. And just as importantly, the relationship offers some real hope in a movie which is mired in the realities of the warfare. Now, this part of the movie differs from the book quite a bit, but I think the filmmakers made the right choice. In the film, the relationship is forward-looking and optimistic. Montserrat in the book had a different resolution, and I remember being kind of upset when I was reading the book after seeing the film to seeing things ended differently and how they did. So after The Cruel Sea, McKenna became a big hit, especially in the 60s. Her major hit was Born Free, which was quite a phenomenon in the early 60s. She was also in A Town Called Alice and portrayed the Duchess of Richmond in the 1970 film Waterloo, again co-starring Jack Hawkins. As I'm handing out plaudits, I really have to include some members of the key members of the film team. Let's start with Eric Hambler, who did the screenplay, working with the novel, and he did a tremendous job adapting it, really keeping it true to the mood of the book. He became quite a maritime specialist. A few years later, he'd do the screenplay for the fantastic Night to Remember, which is the real true story of the Titanic. And he was also involved in 1962's Mutiny on the Bounty. The score was done by Alan Rawsthorne, and it was, again, tremendous for the film. It was subdued in places, emotional in places, just what was needed. Finally, Gordon Dines was the chief cinematographer, and he was working in black and white, and he shot the film very well. It was very fitting, I think, to do this film in black and white, and let's face it, also importantly, it allowed them to use real World War II footage in places, including footage of captured U-boats that are featured near the end of the movie. I'm going to conclude by taking a look at probably the key emotional scene of the movie and what it represents and how it gets to the guts of the film, and then compare it to another movie. So during one of his convoy crossings, Erickson finally confronts an elusive submarine, and he's got an opportunity to finally sink one. Unfortunately, he's also confronted by the fact that there are a bunch of survivors from a merchant ship that are in the water. And then he has this horrible decision to make about whether he goes after the submarine, and if he does, throwing the explosives into the water are likely going to kill a lot of the men who are swimming in the water. And it's a very tough scene and speaks to what the captain has to face.
What's it look like now, number one? It's the firmest contact we've ever had.
There's some men in the water just about there.
Well, there's a U-boat just underneath them. Attacking, stand by.
Now I want to compare that to 1942's In Which We Serve, which is also a very good naval movie, but it was made at a different time and it's reflective of that. This was a major project for Noel Coward. He really wanted to do something for the war effort. So he wrote, starred, and mainly directed the film, although a lot of people say David Lean actually played quite a bit of a film. And it's a very good naval movie, but it's also patriotic and heroic. And you would expect that for a movie made during the war when you were trying to boost morale. Now, by contrast, The Cruel Sea is memorable because of its downplayed honesty. You feel you're getting the straight goods for what these men went through. And I'd just like to conclude by reading from Hawkins' own biography where he talked about the film and why he wanted to do it. I'm just going to read it out. All of us in the film were sure that we were going to make something quite unusual and a long way removed from the Errol Flynn taking Burma single-handed syndrome. This was the period of some very indifferent American war movies, whereas The Cruel Sea contained no false heroics. That is why we all felt that we were making a genuine example of the way in which a group of men went to war. So I really hope you enjoyed this. It was quite a labor of love for me. It was my first video. I hope to make more. Plan to make more. Now, if you're looking for some companion movies, two really leap to mind. Of course, we've already mentioned Das Boot, one of the most successful German films that have come out since World War II. And it actually was originally produced as a television series and then edited down, and based on the memoirs of a German journalist who served on the ship. And that makes a very interesting contrast with The Cruel Sea, of course, because you've got the other side of the story. As well, I'd recommend a much more recent film called Greyhound, which is streaming on Apple TV these days, starring Tom Hanks. And in that film, Hanks plays an American commander. He's fresh to the war, but he's commanding a flotilla with some more senior officers from the British and Canadian navies. Always nice to see the Canadian Navy finally included. And that's definitely worth a look. So again, hope you really enjoyed this, and thank you for watching, and hope you can come back to Walt's Flicks Picks.